Imagine for a second finding the absolute perfect company. Like the management team is visionary, the product is totally flawless, their balance sheet is pristine.
Absolute dream scenario, right?
Exactly. So you decide to invest your entire portfolio into them, and you do it right in the middle of this massive, roaring economic boom.
Sounds like a solid bet.
Right. But then, over the next 2 years, you just sit there and watch in horror as you lose absolutely every single penny.
Ouch. Yeah.
I mean, how is that even mathematically possible? Well, it's because you bought the most beautiful house in a neighborhood that was, currently burning to the ground.
Which is a terrible real estate strategy.
The worst. And welcome to the deep dive. If you're listening to this right now, you are probably gearing up for your MBA exam and you're staring down the barrel of fundamental analysis.
Specifically, the mechanics of industry analysis.
Exactly. And our mission today is super simple. We are your study partners. But, and this is a hard rule, we are absolutely banning rote memorization today.
Yeah. Memorizing a list of terms is useless. I mean, it'll get you through exactly 10 minutes of a real-world analyst job before you just totally freeze up.
Right, because you don't know how the pieces fit together.
Yeah.
So we're here to unlock the core, like the underlying logic of how the financial world actually breathes. So you can walk into that exam and your future career thinking like a totally deadly, effective investor.
That's exactly the mindset you need, because to value a company, you can't just put it in a vacuum. A stock doesn't exist in isolation.
Okay.
It's constantly fighting against or, maybe riding on the coattails of this massive macroeconomic gravity.
So our goal today is to decode how those industrial neighborhoods function.
Precisely. We are going to completely dissect the biological life cycles of industries, map out how they collide with the rolling waves of global business cycles.
And finally, we're going to look under the hood at the brutal, cage-match competitive forces that dictate whether an industry is even structurally capable of letting its companies make a profit.
Or if it's just, a trap designed to destroy capital.
Okay, let's unpack this right now. Let's start at the absolute foundation. What are we actually talking about when we say industry?
Well, the baseline definition is straightforward enough. It's simply a group of firms producing similar goods.
Right. But when you're looking at the foundational concepts for your exam, you need to understand the fundamental dichotomy of how money flows. You really have to categorize the world into two very evocative camps.
Yeah, sunshine industries and sunset industries.
All right. Sunshine and sunset.
And those aren't just like poetic terms. They're deeply descriptive of capital flow.
Okay, break that down.
So a sunshine industry is an industry on the rising point of its historical cycle. The sun is coming up, the landscape is getting brighter.
So we're talking rapid growth, right?
Exactly. Overwhelming optimism and, most importantly, massive amounts of institutional capital are actively flowing into it. It's the new frontier.
Got it. And the flip side?
The flip side is the sunset industries. The sun is actively going down. The overall trajectory of demand and capital, for that matter, is in a state of permanent decline.
Now, hold on. Let me just challenge that premise right out of the gate. Let's play the role of the skeptical junior analyst here.
Okay, lay it on me.
If I'm looking at the macroeconomy, right, and the GDP is skyrocketing, unemployment is at record lows, interest rates are great, everyone has money to spend.
A perfect economic summer.
Yeah. Won't a rising tide just lift all boats? Like, why do I need to obsess over whether an industry is sunshine or sunset if the entire global economy is pointing straight up?
It's a fair question.
I mean, if people have money, they spend it everywhere, right?
Well, that is actually the most common trap a novice investor falls into, and it's precisely why we do industry analysis in the first place.
Because it's not true.
Because a rising macroeconomic tide does not lift all boats equally. In fact, some boats have massive holes in the hull, and a rising tide just sinks them faster.
Oh, wow. That's a great way to look at it.
Right. Even when the overall economy has its own cycle of ups and downs, all industries in the economy, they just don't move in tandem with it.
So you could have a booming economy, but an industry still fails.
Absolutely. If consumer tastes have permanently shifted away from a product, or, say, a new technology has rendered it totally obsolete, a booming economy will not save it.
Because people having more disposable income doesn't mean they're going to buy a product they literally no longer want or need.
Exactly. You could have all the money in the world, you're not going out to buy a brand new VCR today.
Right, right. So even in the greatest bull market in history, you could park your money in a sunset industry and get completely wiped out while everyone around you is just getting rich.
Precisely. And it goes deeper than just winning or losing, too. Different industries possess completely different risk-return characteristics at any given moment.
What do you mean by that?
Well, say you're managing a pension fund. Okay. You need safe, guaranteed, incremental returns. You are looking for a totally different neighborhood than a venture capitalist who wants a 1,000% return and is totally willing to lose everything to get it.
Okay, so to make those really surgical choices, you have to evaluate a highly specific checklist of variables that differentiate one industry from another.
Yes. And you need to know this checklist for the exam.
Right, so we're talking about things like product lines, raw material inputs, capacity utilization, government policy, labor availability, and future potential.
Right, but let's not just list those off. Let's talk about the why.
Yeah, let's do that. Like, why is raw material input a make or break variable for an entire industry?
Okay, think about the airline industry. What's their primary inescapable raw material input?
Jet fuel.
Exactly, jet fuel, which is inextricably tethered to the global price of crude oil.
Right.
So it does not matter if a specific airline has the absolute best customer service, the newest planes, the smartest routing software in the world.
None of it matters if fuel spikes.
Exactly. If a geopolitical crisis causes the price of oil to quadruple overnight, the entire airline industry's profit margins will just instantly evaporate. They are totally at the mercy of their raw material.
That makes total sense.
I should take...
Government policy.
Yeah.
We often think of industries as these free markets, but policy totally dictates survival.
Oh, 100%.
Like, if you're analyzing the renewable energy sector and a government suddenly passes massive tax subsidies for solar panels, that industry's risk profile just transforms overnight.
It's basically a green light for capital.
Yeah. Conversely, if you're looking at tobacco or maybe certain tech sectors facing antitrust crackdowns, regulatory gravity is pulling them down regardless of how good their products are.
Yep. And then there's labor availability, which is honestly a silent killer of growth.
Oh, tell me about that.
Let's say you have a booming tech sector that requires highly specialized, machine learning engineers.
Okay.
If the educational system in that region is not producing those engineers fast enough, the growth of that entire industry hits a hard, immovable bottleneck.
Oh, because they physically can't hire people to do the work.
Right. The companies have the capital, they have the consumer demand, but they physically cannot build the product. The industry constraints override the individual company's ambition.
Which is why institutional bodies obsess over categorizing these industries. Like, to track these massive macroeconomic forces, you really have to put things in buckets.
You do.
Look at how central banks, like the Reserve Bank of India, classify things. They group companies based on the production of goods.
Right.
So you've got food and food products, textiles, basic metals and alloys, non-metallic mineral products, chemicals.
Yeah, that's very specific.
Why do central banks care about this level of granularity? Like, why not just look at the stock market as a whole?
Because it allows them to track the actual pulse of the economy. If you group all the basic metals and alloys companies together, you know that they are all going to be subjected to the same overarching economic forces.
Because they're all playing the same game.
Right. They all need similar raw materials, they all rely heavily on industrial demand, and they all react similarly to changes in interest rates.
Okay.
So by grouping them, an analyst or a central bank can look at the aggregate data and say, okay, the basic metals sector is contracting right now.
Which means what?
Which means industrial construction is slowing down, which is a massive leading indicator that a broader economic slowdown might be coming. It's about finding the signal in the noise.
Okay, so that's the categorization piece. But understanding the categories is really just setting the pieces on the chessboard. It doesn't tell you how to actually win the game.
No, it doesn't.
To move from observing an industry to actually making a profitable investment decision, you have to adopt a specific strategic mindset.
And this is huge for your MBA toolkit.
Yeah, and in the world of equity investing, there are two distinct, almost warring schools of thought on how to do this: the bottom-up approach and the top-down approach.
This is a foundational concept. It will completely dictate how you operate as an analyst.
I've always visualized this as the difference between a microscope and a telescope.
I like that.
Let's start with a microscope. The bottom-up approach. When you're a bottom-up investor, you are zoomed all the way in on the granular hard data of a single company. You're using quantitative screens to filter out the noise. You aren't watching the macroeconomic news. You're looking at spreadsheets.
And for the exam, you need to know the specific metrics a bottom-up screener is looking for. They are looking for absolute numerical superiority.
Give me some examples from the text.
Well, for instance, they might set their algorithm to only flag companies that have a return on equity and ROE above 15%.
Let's pause right there, because memorizing ROE above 15% is completely useless if you don't know what it means.
True.
Why 15%? What is ROE actually telling the bottom-up investor?
So return on equity is essentially a measure of management's efficiency. If I give a company $100 of my personal equity, how much profit can they generate with that specific $100?
Okay, so it's a ratio.
Exactly. An ROE of 15% means for every $100 of shareholder equity, the company is generating $15 of pure profit. It proves a company is a highly efficient wealth creation machine.
And they might also screen for a massive growth rate, right? Say,
Yeah.
revenue growth of at least 20% year over year.
Yes, growth is key for bottom up.
Or they look for a specific valuation metric, like a price to earnings, a PE multiple of less than 10. Explain the psychology of that PE ratio. Why less than 10?
The PE ratio tells you how much you're paying for $1 of the company's earnings.
Okay.
If a company has a PE of 10, you are literally paying $10 to get access to every $1 of profit they make.
Got it.
So a bottom-up investor looking for a PE of less than 10 is hunting for a bargain. They are saying, I want a company that is highly efficient, growing incredibly fast, but the broader market is currently ignoring it, so it is cheap to buy.
So my software spits out a list of companies that hit the holy trinity. ROE over 15%, growth over 20%, PE under 10. And once I have that isolated list, then I start doing the qualitative deep dive.
Exactly.
I read their specific annual reports. I listen to their specific earnings calls. I look at the CEO's track record. I am totally obsessed with the microenvironment.
Yes. You start at the very bottom with the individual firm, and you build your thesis upward.
Right.
But, and this is critical, there is a massive inherent danger in this approach, and it goes back to our opening analogy about the burning neighborhood.
The perfectly managed company in the dying industry.
Exactly. A bottom-up investor is so hyper-focused on the company's specific metrics that they might inadvertently invest in a brilliantly managed company that operates within a sunset industry.
Wait. If the company is generating 20% revenue growth and has an amazing ROE, why should I care if the industry is struggling? If I found a diamond in a dumpster, isn't it still a diamond?
It is, until the dumpster gets set on fire.
Okay, fair point.
The bottom-up investor makes a really bold assumption. They believe that an exceptional management team and a superior product can just defy macroeconomic gravity.
And can they?
Sometimes, yes. They're right sometimes.
Yeah.
But more often than not, if the entire industry is facing structural decline, let's say you found the most efficiently run, highly profitable manufacturer of fax machines in the year 2005.
Oh, man.
Right. It does not matter how good their ROE is. The structural collapse of the entire fax machine industry will eventually choke out their distribution channels, dry up their supplier base, and completely crush their multiples.
So they're fighting a war of attrition they literally cannot win.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the telescope.
Yeah.
The top-down approach. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the top-down investor thinks the bottom-up investor is insane for ignoring the macro environment.
Oh, they think they're crazy. The top-down approach reverses the sequence entirely.
How so?
Before they even look at a single stock ticker, before they care about anyone's ROE, they look at the global macroeconomic universe. They ask massive global questions.
Like what?
Like, is the global economy entering a recession? Are central banks raising interest rates to fight inflation? What is the geopolitical stability of the energy markets right now?
They're essentially forecasting the weather before they decide what crop to plant.
That is a perfect way to put it. Based on those massive macro factors, they identify which specific industries are structurally poised to benefit from that specific weather pattern.
Precisely. They find the winning neighborhood first.
Only after they have concluded, for example, that high inflation means the basic materials industry will outperform, do they finally pull out the microscope.
And start looking for companies.
Then and only then do they look for the best managed basic materials company to actually buy.
Right.
They demand a good house, but they absolutely insist it must be in a thriving neighborhood.
But here is the catch. If you're going to be a top-down investor, you are playing a game of timing. You are betting that you know what the economy is doing right now, and more importantly, what it is going to do next.
Which is incredibly hard.
Right. You have to be a master of sector rotation and the business cycle. And this is where industry analysis stops being static and becomes incredibly dynamic.
Yeah, because the global economy is a living, breathing organism. It does not operate in a straight line. It breathes in and out. And this breathing is what we call the business cycle.
Okay, so let's define that for the example.
It is the regular cyclical fluctuations in the overall level of economic activity.
And it touches absolutely everything. It's not just a chart on a Bloomberg terminal. When the business cycle shifts, it violently impacts global trade.
Oh, absolutely.
Like if the U.S. goes into a recession, they stop buying goods from emerging markets, which triggers recessions locally in those manufacturing countries.
It's a domino effect.
It impacts aggregate employment,
Mhm.
massive capital investment, interest rates, and the very price of the food you buy. But the trickiest part, the part that makes investing so incredibly difficult, is that while these cycles are regular, they are not predictable.
That is the crucial nuance you need to grasp. You cannot set a calendar by them. A full cycle can last anywhere from 2 years to 10 years.
You can't just say, well, it's been 4 years, time for a recession.
Right. You have to constantly monitor the vital signs of the economy to figure out where you currently stand in the cycle.
I think the most powerful analogy here is the 4 seasons. Let's map the phases of the business cycle to the seasons of the year, but with the caveat that you never know if winter's going to last 3 months or 3 years.
I love that. Let's start with expansion. This is spring.
The thaw.
Exactly. The ice of the previous recession is thawing out. Consumer confidence is tentatively returning. Businesses start seeing an uptick in demand, so they start hiring again.
And when they hire, unemployment begins to fall.
Right. Which means more people have paychecks, which means consumer spending increases even further. It is a virtuous upward spiral.
And that spiral keeps accelerating until we reach the peak. This is summer.
The hottest part of the year.
The economy is absolutely scorching hot. Everyone who wants a job has one. Factories are running at maximum capacity. But here is where the danger starts, right? Summer brings the heat, and in economics, heat is inflation.
Always.
Why does the peak inevitably trigger inflation? Let's walk through that mechanism.
Because you hit a hard physical limit. The demand for goods and services is so incredibly high that businesses physically cannot produce them fast enough.
They're maxed out.
They're maxed out. There are no more unemployed workers to hire to increase production. So what happens when you have an overwhelming amount of money chasing a strictly limited supply of goods?
Prices skyrocket.
Prices skyrocket. That is inflation. And when inflation gets too high, central banks are forced to step in and raise interest rates to cool the economy down.
Which acts as a brake on the economy, and that triggers the contraction.
Right.
The leaves start turning brown, autumn has arrived. Sometimes we call it a recession, or if it's totally catastrophic, a depression.
Yeah, that's when things get ugly.
Interest rates are high, so borrowing money becomes expensive. Businesses stop expanding and they start laying people off. Unemployment rises, people get scared, they stop spending money, and corporate profits plummet.
And this downward spiral continues until all the excess has been totally purged from the system, bringing us to the trough.
Winter.
The absolute bottom of the cycle. Economic activity is frozen. Asset prices are deeply, deeply depressed. But historically, this is where the seeds of the next expansion are planted. Things get so cheap that eventually bold investors start deploying capital again, and the spring thaw begins anew.
So if you are an active top-down investor, you are not just a passive observer of these seasons. You are actively utilizing the art of sector rotation.
Yes.
Your entire job is to move your capital to the specific industry that benefits from the current season. You are literally migrating to where the sun is shining.
Sector rotation is the deliberate, prudent switching from one industry group to another at the opportune time. It is a highly tactical maneuver. Let's break down the exact playbook for this, because understanding the underlying logic here is guaranteed to be tested.
Okay, let's start at the top of the roller coaster, the peak. It's summer, the economy is running at max capacity, and inflation is running rampant. The cost of everything is going up. Where do I rotate my money to protect it?
When inflation is tearing through the economy, you rotate into the basic materials sector.
Okay, give me examples.
Oil, natural gas, industrial metals, agricultural commodities.
But wait, let me stop you right there because that feels counterintuitive to me.
How so?
If inflation is high, doesn't that mean it costs an oil company more money to drill for the oil? It costs a mining company more to extract the copper. Aren't their operational costs exploding just like everyone else's?
They absolutely are. Their costs of labor, their costs of machinery, it all goes up. However, these industries possess the ultimate superpower in an inflationary environment.
It's just
Absolute pricing power. They control the foundational raw materials that the rest of the world desperately needs to function. So if their cost to extract oil goes up by 10%, they simply raise the price of a barrel of oil by 15%. They pass the entire burden of inflation directly onto the consumer.
Wow.
And in doing so, they often actually expand their profit margins during a peak. While every other industry is getting crushed by rising input costs, the basic materials sector is the one causing the crush.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. They own the building blocks. But what happens when the central banks crush the economy to stop that inflation and we enter the contraction? Winter is here, people losing jobs, consumer spending falls off a cliff. Where do I hide my portfolio now?
During a severe contraction, aggregate demand collapses. People stop taking luxury vacations, they stop buying new electronics, they cancel their streaming subscriptions.
Because they're broke.
Right. But you have to look at what human beings physically cannot stop doing. We still have to eat. We still get sick and need medicine. We still need basic hygiene products.
So you rotate into what we call consumer staples.
Yeah.
Or defensive industries.
Exactly. Pharmaceuticals, food producers, utility companies, basic beverages. These industries have what economists call highly inelastic demand.
Meaning?
Meaning their sales volume is relatively immune to the macroeconomic weather because they sell survival. During a recession, their revenue might be completely flat. But while the rest of the stock market is plummeting 30%, flat revenue is a massive victory.
We survive the winter and spring finally arrives. The expansion begins. Interest rates have come down. People are getting hired again. They feel confident. Where does the smart money go now?
Now you rotate out of the boring defensive stocks and into cyclical industries. Specifically, you look for consumer durables.
Consumer durables. We are talking about refrigerators, washing machines, automobiles, high-end electronics, things that last a long time. Why do they explode during an expansion?
Think about the psychology of the consumer during the recession we just had. Your washing machine started making a terrible noise during the contraction phase. But you were worried about losing your job, so you didn't buy a new one. You paid $50 to patch it up and just prayed it would last. You postponed the purchase.
So millions of people have been postponing their purchases for 2 whole years.
Exactly. And the moment the economy thaws, the moment you get a new job or a raise, all of that delayed, pent-up demand gets unleashed into the market at the exact same time.
You finally go buy that new washing machine. You finally buy that new car.
Yep. The revenue for these cyclical, durable companies doesn't just recover, it explodes upward at an incredible velocity. That is how you ride the wave of an expansion.
But the business cycle isn't the only thing altering the landscape. It is critical to understand that while cycles are temporary weather patterns, there is also climate change.
Oh, great point.
There are long-term, deep-seated structural changes that completely redraw the map of what industries will succeed, regardless of whether we are in an expansion or a recession.
This is a vital distinction for any MBA student. If you only look at the business cycle, you are missing the tectonic plates shifting underneath it.
Yeah.
Structural economic changes operate on a much longer, multi-decade timeline. We're talking about fundamental shifts in demographics, massive technological paradigm shifts, changes in societal lifestyles, and permanent regulatory overhauls.
Let's talk about demographics, because demographics is arguably destiny.
Yeah.
If you are analyzing a country and you see that their birth rate has collapsed and their population is rapidly aging.
Like Japan, for instance.
Yes, exactly like Japan. You've uncovered a massive structural reality. It does not matter if the economy is currently booming or busting. The healthcare, pharmaceutical, and elder care industries in that country are going to experience massive, inescapable structural growth over the next 20 years simply because there will be tens of millions of more elderly people.
And you also have to look at structural shifts in lifestyle and education. Take India, for example.
Right.
Over the last 2 decades, there has been a profound structural shift in living standards, urbanization, and consumption patterns.
Oh, for sure.
Because of this structural rise in the middle class, industries like organized retail, lifestyle products, and modern fashion are experiencing massive long-term tailwinds.
There's also the structural advantage of sheer human capital there. The massive success of the IT and IT-enabled services sector in India isn't just a random fluctuation.
Well, it's not.
It is built on a demographic structural advantage.
Huh.
The massive availability of highly educated brain power, particularly in STEM fields. That is a structural moat that takes decades to build and gives those industries a permanent advantage on the global stage.
So to summarize the top-down reality so far, you have to understand the macroeconomic business cycle to time your sector rotations, while simultaneously keeping your eye on the long-term structural changes that dictate the overall landscape.
But even if you master all of that, even if you predict the global economy perfectly, you still aren't done.
Nope.
Because an industry isn't just a boat tossed around on the macro ocean. It has its own internal biological clock. It is born, it grows, it ages, and it dies. And that internal timeline dictates its profitability just as much as the overall economy does.
This is what we call the industry life cycle. We are zooming in from the macroeconomy to the specific timeline of the industry itself. And just like human aging, there are 4 distinct, unavoidable phases.
What are they?
The preliminary or introduction stage, the growth stage, the stability or maturity stage, and the decline stage.
Let's dissect the biology of an industry, starting with phase 1, the preliminary or introduction stage. This is the infancy of the industry. A new technology has been invented or a radical new concept has been introduced to the market, but it's not a celebration. It's a desperate fight for survival.
The financial characteristics of an industry in this stage are incredibly hostile.
Tell me about it.
Sales are extremely modest because the general public barely knows the product exists. More importantly, profit margins are almost universally negative. The companies are just hemorrhaging cash.
Wait, why are they losing so much money if they have this brilliant new invention?
Because the barrier to getting off the ground is monumental. First, they are burdened with massive historical research and development costs that they have to pay off.
Oh, right. The R&D phase.
But more critically, they are spending all their capital trying to simply build a market from scratch. They have to educate the consumer. They have to spend exorbitant amounts of money on advertising just to convince people that they actually need this new product. They are literally paying to create demand.
It is absolute chaos. It's a survival of the fittest environment. There are dozens of small, scrappy startups, all trying to establish themselves, all burning through venture capital, and they are all fighting a brutal war to become the market leader. Why is being the market leader in phase 1 so critical?
Because the company that manages to capture the majority of the early market share gets to set the standard for the entire industry going forward.
They write the rules.
Exactly. They define what the product should look like and how it should function. If you establish the standard, everyone else has to play catch-up to your rules. But the grim reality is, the vast majority of firms in this stage will go bankrupt before they ever see a single dime of profit.
If you want concrete examples of industries currently fighting in this preliminary arena, look at bioinformatics, cutting-edge biotech, eco-friendly synthetic materials, or highly specialized cyber media. These are frontiers. Investing here is pure speculation. You're basically betting on which infant will survive to adulthood.
But for the rare companies that do survive the bloodbath of phase 1, the reward is immense. They graduate to phase 2, the growth stage. This is the adolescence and early adulthood of the industry.
Okay, so the product has been validated.
Yes, the public understands it, they want it, and demand goes absolutely parabolic.
This is where you see rapid, accelerating double-digit sales growth quarter over quarter. The surviving companies are basically printing money. But there is a fascinating, almost paradoxical detail about the financial mechanics of the growth stage that always confused me.
What's that?
While sales are skyrocketing and absolute profits are massive, the profit margins, the percentage of each sale they get to keep as profit, actually begin to decline. How does that make sense? If you are selling more than ever, shouldn't you be more profitable per unit?
This is where the competitive dynamics of capitalism kick in. During the transition from phase 1 to phase 2, those few surviving companies were making enormous margins because they basically had a monopoly on the new product.
Right.
But the market is perfectly efficient at sniffing out outsized profits. Those massive margins act like a giant neon sign to the rest of the business world, screaming, "There's easy money to be made here."
So the sharks smell the blood in the water.
Exactly. This attracts a massive influx of new competitors into the industry. Giant corporations from adjacent industries pivot their massive resources to get a piece of the action. Now, instead of 3 companies selling the product, there are 30.
And how do those new competitors try to steal market share from the established players?
They start undercutting them on price.
Oh, they start price wars.
Precisely. They launch brutal price wars. And the established players are forced to lower their prices to defend their market share. Furthermore, because everyone is trying to scale up at the exact same time, the cost of raw materials and specialized labor goes up due to increased demand.
Wow, okay.
So your costs are rising and your selling price is falling. Your total revenue is still going up because the overall market is expanding so fast, but your profit margin on each individual unit slowly, inevitably compresses.
Classic examples of industries in this growth phase right now, or recently, include mobile technology, advanced pharmaceuticals, certain sectors of information technology, and modernized healthcare services. They are massive, they are growing rapidly, but the competition is utterly ferocious, constantly driving down margins.
And eventually, the explosive growth exhausts itself. The market just runs out of new people to sell to. The industry calms down and enters middle age. Phase 3, the stabilization or maturity stage.
This is the longest phase of the industry life cycle. The wild, double-digit growth days are permanently over. The industry is fully developed.
The defining characteristic here is normal sales growth. The market is saturated. Almost everyone who's going to buy the product already owns it.
Right.
Therefore, sales are primarily driven by two things: overall population growth and replacement demand, meaning people buying a new one when their old one breaks.
And the profit margins here compress even further.
Yeah.
Why does the profitability drop again?
It is the ultimate result of market saturation and consolidation. Because the overall pie is no longer growing rapidly, the only way for a company to grow its revenue is to violently steal a slice of the pie from a competitor.
It's a zero-sum game now.
Completely zero sum. This leads to heavy consolidation. The big players buy up the smaller ones. The industry becomes dominated by a few massive, slow-moving giants. They compete fiercely on price, and they have to spend massive amounts of money on marketing just to maintain brand loyalty.
In this stage, survival is no longer about brilliant innovation. It is about ruthless operational efficiency. It's about shaving half a penny off the manufacturing cost of a unit.
These are the bedrock industries of the modern economy: textiles, steel manufacturing, traditional oil and gas, heavy manufacturing, and massive business process outsourcing, or BPO operations. They employ millions of people, they generate massive amounts of steady cash, but they are not going to double in size anytime soon.
Finally, we reach the end of the line. Phase 4. The decline stage. The industry enters old age.
This is where the math gets brutal. In the decline stage, sales growth actually turns negative. The total addressable market is actively shrinking year after year.
Consequently, profit margins collapse to near zero or become totally negative. The rate of return on invested capital plummets. Why? Because the industry has been structurally superseded.
Right, a new technology has emerged, or consumer tastes have fundamentally and permanently shifted away. The companies are left with massive factories and infrastructure that are literally no longer needed.
And there is a critical accelerator to this aging process that you must understand: the tech factor.
Oh, this is essential.
The life cycle is not a set number of years. An industry based on heavy physical infrastructure, like steel or railroads, might stay in the maturity phase for a century. But for industries heavily reliant on technology, the threat of technological obsolescence dramatically shortens the duration of every phase.
Because technology compresses time. A tech-based industry might rocket from introduction through growth into maturity and crash into decline in the span of 15 years.
Wow, 15 years.
Look at the personal computer industry. It grew explosively in the 90s, matured in the 2000s, and is now often considered in a state of structural decline as it gets heavily substituted by smartphones, tablets, and mobile computing.
Other classic examples of declining industries include print media, traditional paper manufacturing, and certain types of legacy mining.
So we now have two massive frameworks overlapping each other. We have the macroeconomic business cycle, the rolling seasons of expansion and recession, and we have the microeconomic industry life cycle, the biological clock ticking from introduction to decline.
How do we synthesize these? How do we categorize an industry based on how its internal biological clock reacts to the external macroeconomic weather?
This is where we bring everything together into 4 specific exam-critical classifications. You have to be able to place an industry into one of these 4 buckets: growth industries, cyclical industries, defensive industries, and the hybrid cyclical growth industries.
Okay, let's start with bucket number 1, growth industries. Now, this is a specific classification, not just an industry in the growth phase of its life cycle, right?
Yeah.
What defines a true growth industry in this context?
A true growth industry is characterized by abnormally high growth rates in sales and earnings that seem to completely ignore the macroeconomic environment. The key is why they are growing so fast.
Okay, why?
It is usually driven by a monumental change in the state of technology, a radical innovative technique, or a massive structural shift in society.
So they're essentially creating their own weather. Because their product is so revolutionary or the structural demand is so overwhelming, they will continue to post massive revenue growth even if the broader global economy slips into a mild recession.
Exactly. People might be losing their jobs, but corporations are still forced to buy this new technology because if they don't, they will be left behind by their competitors. The underlying structural force overpowers the cyclical economic drag.
Okay, so that's bucket number one. Bucket number two is the exact polar opposite. Cyclical industries. We touched on these earlier. These are industries that are violently tethered to the trade cycle. They are highly sensitive to the macroeconomic weather.
They are the consumer durables, the cars, the appliances, the heavy machinery. They soar into the stratosphere during economic prosperity because credit is cheap and everyone feels rich. But they absolutely crash during a recession.
And remember the core mechanism, postponement. You cannot postpone buying food. You can postpone buying a new car for 3 years if you're worried about your job.
That ability for the consumer to instantly turn off the demand tap is what makes an industry cyclical. Their earnings charts look like jagged mountain ranges, soaring in the summer, collapsing in the winter.
Then we have bucket number three, defensive industries. These are the anchors of a portfolio. They are the least impacted by economic downswings.
These are the consumer staples, utilities, and basic healthcare. They provide the absolute necessities of life. But as an analyst, you need to understand the psychological behavior of the investor who buys these companies.
Right, the motivation is completely different. If you buy a high-flying tech growth stock, you are buying it for capital appreciation. You are hoping the stock price goes from $10 to $50.
But defensive industries are usually in the mature phase of their life cycle. A massive utility company is not going to quadruple in size, so why do investors buy them?
They buy them for income.
Exactly. Defensive stocks are prized because they generate massive, highly predictable streams of cash flow, regardless of whether the economy is booming or crashing. And because they don't need to spend all that cash on rapid expansion, they return it to the shareholders in the form of rich, steady dividends.
During a brutal recession, when growth stocks are collapsing by 50%, the defensive investor is just sitting back, protecting their capital, and quietly collecting a 5% dividend yield every single quarter.
And finally, bucket number 4, which sounds like an absolute paradox, cyclical growth industries.
Yeah, how can an industry be heavily dependent on the boom and bust cycle, but also be classified as a massive growth industry?
It is a fascinating hybrid, and it usually applies to massive technological paradigm shifts that require heavy capital investment. Think about the semiconductor industry or the commercial aviation manufacturing industry at the dawn of the jet age.
Okay, let's look at semiconductors. The long-term structural demand for microchips is a massive, unstoppable growth trend. Every year, the world needs billions more chips for cars, phones, and AI. So it has the long-term trajectory of a growth industry.
But the purchasers of those chips, the auto manufacturers, the consumer electronics companies, are highly cyclical.
Oh, I see.
Right. So when a severe global recession hits, those cyclical companies stop making cars and phones, which means they abruptly stop ordering microchips. The semiconductor industry, despite its long-term growth trend, suddenly hits a wall and experiences a violent cyclical crash.
But the key is what happens next. When the recession ends, a cyclical growth industry doesn't just recover to its previous baseline. It aggressively resumes its massive upward growth trajectory, driven by that underlying technological shift.
They take 3 steps forward during the boom, get knocked 1 massive step back during the bust, and then take 3 explosive steps forward again.
All right, let's take a breath and summarize where we are. We have built an incredible macro framework. We understand how to read the economic weather with the business cycle. We know how to time our investments using sector rotation. We understand the biological aging of an industry from introduction to decline. And we know how to classify their sensitivity to the macro environment.
But here is the terrifying reality for an analyst. You could do all of that perfectly.
Right.
You could identify an industry that is in the explosive growth phase of its life cycle, operating right at the beginning of a massive macroeconomic expansion. Every macro indicator is flashing bright green.
Sounds perfect.
And yet, when you look at the actual companies inside that industry, you realize they are all going bankrupt.
Wait, how is that possible? How can a growing industry in a booming economy destroy wealth?
Because the macroeconomic weather is totally irrelevant if the internal structural foundation of the industry is toxic. The industry might be growing, but the way the companies are forced to compete with each other prevents any of them from actually capturing the profit. To analyze that internal battleground, we have to look at the ultimate framework in any MBA curriculum, Michael Porter's 5 forces model.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. This is the holy grail of competitive analysis. Porter's 5 forces is a framework that maps out the fundamental attractiveness of an industry by dissecting the 5 distinct forces that dictate competitive intensity.
The underlying premise of Porter's model is that these five forces act as a crushing gravitational weight on the profitability of the industry. The stronger the forces, the lower the profit potential for everyone involved.
As an analyst, you use this framework to determine if an industry is structurally capable of generating high returns on capital, or if it is just a brutal, low-margin cage match where everyone bleeds.
Let's tear down each of these five forces, force by force. Force number one, competitive rivalry among existing firms. This is the battle happening right now in the trenches between the companies currently in the market. What makes this rivalry go from a polite competition to a margin-destroying bloodbath?
Well, several structural factors ignite severe rivalry. First, look at the competitors themselves. If there are many players in the industry, and they are all roughly the same size with equal market power, the rivalry is intense. No single firm is strong enough to dictate terms or act as the price leader, so they constantly fight over every inch of territory.
And it gets infinitely worse if the overall growth of the industry is slow. If the pie is getting bigger every day, everyone can eat without fighting. But in a slow growth or stagnant industry, the pie is fixed. The only mathematical way for a company to grow its revenue is to physically steal a customer from a competitor.
And how do you steal a customer when your products are relatively similar? You start a price war. You slash your prices to undercut your rival. Your rival responds by slashing their prices. Soon, everyone is selling the product at a fraction of a percent above cost, completely destroying the profit margins for the entire industry.
But here is a question. If a price war is destroying everyone's profits, why don't some companies just give up, close their factories, and leave the industry? Why stay and bleed?
Because of what Porter calls exit barriers. This is a crucial concept. Sometimes it is financially devastating to leave an industry.
Give me an example.
Imagine you operate a massive steel mill. You've invested billions of dollars in highly specialized blast furnaces that literally cannot be used for anything else. You have ironclad, unbreakable 20-year union contracts with your labor force. You have long-term purchase agreements with iron ore mines.
If you shut down, you still have to pay all of those massive fixed costs, but you have zero revenue coming in.
Exactly.
Mm.
So you are trapped.
Mm.
Even if the price of steel crashes and you are operating at a net loss, it's actually cheaper to keep producing steel at a loss than it is to shut the factory down and trigger all the exit penalties.
So these companies stay in the market, they keep pumping excess supply into the system, which keeps prices permanently depressed, ruining the profitability for everyone, including the healthy companies. High exit barriers create zombie companies that drag the whole industry down.
That is terrifying. Another factor the framework highlights for intense rivalry is low switching costs. If it costs a customer absolutely nothing to drop your brand and switch to your competitor, the rivalry is manic. Think about fast food. If Burger King raises the price of a burger by 50 cents, the customer feels zero friction in driving across the street to McDonald's.
Because the switching cost is zero.
Exactly. So those companies have to spend billions on marketing and price promotions just to maintain their hyper-fragile market share.
So force one is the internal war. Force number two looks at the threat from the outside, the threat of new entrants.
The logic here is built on the purest mechanism of capitalism. If an industry manages to become highly profitable and the existing firms are making massive margins, that profit acts like a giant, irresistible magnet. It signals to entrepreneurs and giant corporations everywhere, look at all this free money.
But what happens when those new entrants arrive to crash the party? They build new factories, which adds massive new capacity to the market. To win market share, they introduce introductory pricing, dragging overall prices down.
And their costs go up too, right?
Yeah, they start bidding against the existing firms for the same specialized labor and raw materials, driving operational costs up. Prices go down, costs go up, and eventually the influx of new entrants forces those unusually high profit margins to compress back down to an unexciting equilibrium level.
So how does any industry ever stay profitable long term? The existing firms have to build fortresses. They have to construct what the framework calls barriers to entry. These are the structural moats around the castle that make it incredibly difficult, expensive, or illegal for a new player to enter the game. Let's break down the most powerful moats.
Capital expenditure is the most basic physical moat. If you want to start a new aerospace company to compete with Boeing or Airbus, you need tens of billions of dollars just to build the manufacturing infrastructure before you ever sell a single plane. That massive capital requirement instantly eliminates 99.9% of potential new entrants.
Then you have legal and technological barriers, patents. If a pharmaceutical company invents a cure for a disease and patents it, it is literally illegal for anyone else to manufacture it for 20 years. They have an absolute government-enforced monopoly.
You also have to consider the invisible barrier of economies of scale. Let's say you want to start a new electric vehicle company. Because you are new, you only need to buy a few thousand batteries. Your supplier charges you a massive premium.
But the established giant in the industry is buying millions of batteries a month.
Exactly. They negotiate a massive volume discount. The established player can literally manufacture and sell their entire finished car for less than what it costs you just to buy the parts. You cannot compete on price because you do not have their scale.
You also have established supply chain relationships, brand loyalty that takes decades to build, and massive regulatory hurdles, like getting a new bank charter approved by the government. The ultimate exam takeaway, explicitly stated in the framework, is that the most attractive industry for an investor, the holy grail of profitability, is an industry with extremely high entry barriers, keeping the barbarians outside the gates, and very low exit barriers, allowing the weak players inside to easily pack up and leave without destroying pricing power.
Let's move down the value chain. Force number 3 is the bargaining power of buyers. This looks at the customers who actually purchase the industry's product. The core concept is that when buyers are massive or highly concentrated, they essentially hold the industry hostage.
The classic, brilliant example used to illustrate this is the relationship between passenger car manufacturers and the automobile component industry. Let's look at the companies that manufacture spark plugs, windshields, and brake pads.
In this scenario, the component manufacturers are the industry we are analyzing, and the massive car companies, Ford, Toyota, Volkswagen, are their buyers. And because there are only a handful of these massive global car companies, and they are buying parts in lots of tens of millions, the balance of power is entirely lopsided.
It is basically a hostage negotiation.
Yeah.
The massive car manufacturer can walk into the brake pad company and say, "We represent 60% of your total annual revenue. We demand that you lower your price by 10% next year, and we demand higher quality materials." What can the brake pad company do? If they say no, the car company takes their massive contract to a competitor, and the brake pad company goes bankrupt overnight.
Exactly. The buyer dictates the terms of survival. The component maker has absolutely no pricing power. They are forced to accept razor-thin, deteriorating profit margins because the buyer holds all the leverage. You always have to ask yourself the fundamental question of power dynamics. Who needs who more? The parts supplier desperately needs the car manufacturer. The car manufacturer has a dozen other parts suppliers waiting in line.
Now, let's flip that exact same power dynamic in reverse. Force number 4, the bargaining power of suppliers. This looks at the companies that provide the crucial raw materials or inputs to the industry we are analyzing.
If an industry relies on a raw material that is only produced by a tiny handful of suppliers, or if that input is highly unique and irreplaceable, those suppliers hold a loaded gun to the head of the industry's profitability.
Let's say you manufacture high-end smartphones, and there is only one company in the world that manufactures the specific microchip you need for your camera. That supplier can raise their prices by 20%, and you have no choice but to pay it. It is difficult, costly, or physically impossible for you to switch to another supplier because there is no one else. The supplier sucks all the profit out of your industry and keeps it for themselves.
But here is a fascinating, often overlooked detail in the framework that trips up a lot of analysts. When we say suppliers, we immediately think of physical goods companies selling steel, silicon, or oil. But human capital is an input. Organized labor counts as a highly powerful supplier.
Wait, really? Organized labor? That is a bombshell realization.
Yeah, a labor union is a supplier of human effort. If an industry relies heavily on a specialized, highly organized militant union, that union acts exactly like a monopoly supplier of steel. They have the power to shut down the entire industry via a strike.
Because they hold that leverage.
Because they hold that leverage, they can consistently demand higher wages, expanded pensions, and better benefits, which acts as a permanent, escalating tax on the long-term profitability of every firm in that industry.
Finally, we arrive at force number 5, the threat of substitute products. This is the silent assassin. It is the force that puts a hard, unbreakable ceiling on the prices an industry can charge, capping their ultimate profitability.
Let's be very clear on the definition because it's a common mistake. A substitute is not a direct competitor. A Boeing plane is not a substitute for an Airbus plane. That is force 1, rivalry. A substitute is a completely different product, often from a totally different industry, that satisfies the exact same underlying consumer need.
A classic historical example. Railroads thought they were in the railroad business, so they only worried about competing with other railroads. They didn't realize they were actually in the transportation business. Their ultimate threat wasn't a better train. It was the invention of the commercial airplane. The airplane was the substitute that permanently capped the growth of the passenger rail industry.
You see this everywhere in modern tech. Tablets acting as a substitute for laptops for casual web browsing, smartphones completely substituting landline telephones.
I think the most relatable example is looking at home appliances. Consider the industry that manufactures traditional gas burners for kitchens. If you are analyzing that industry, you might look at Force One and say, wow, there's not much rivalry. They have great brand loyalty. You might conclude that the gas burner company can safely raise their prices by 20% next year to boost their profit margins.
But then you look at Force 5. What happens if they raise the price of a gas burner by 20%? The consumer goes to the store, looks at the expensive gas burner, and then looks at a high-tech induction cooker or even an air fryer sitting on the next shelf. The induction cooker is a completely different technology, but it fulfills the exact same need, cooking food quickly.
If the gas burner gets too expensive, the consumer simply abandons the industry entirely and buys the substitute. The very existence of the induction cooker acts as an invisible force field, preventing the gas burner industry from ever jacking up their prices too high. It permanently caps their margins.
So when is this threat of substitution the most lethal? How do we quantify the danger?
The framework gives us the formula for maximum substitution risk. The threat is highest when two specific conditions collide. First, the perceived level of differentiation between the products is low in the mind of the consumer. If the customer thinks a gas burner, an induction cooker, whatever, it heats up my pan, then the products are highly substitutable.
And the second condition is the friction of switching.
Exactly. When the cost for the customer to switch from one to the other is negligible, the threat is maximum. If I have to spend $10,000 to rip out my gas lines to install an induction cooker, the switching cost is high, so the gas company is relatively safe. But if I can just plug an induction hot plate into a standard wall outlet for $50, the switching cost is zero. When the products seem the same and switching is free, the incumbent industry has absolutely zero pricing power. They're living on borrowed time.
Wow. Okay. We have unpacked a monumental amount of financial machinery today. Let's do a high-speed final synthesis to hardwire this into your brain for the exam.
We started by defining the boundaries of an industry, recognizing that a rising macroeconomic tide does not save a sunset industry. We established the two lenses of investing: the bottom-up microscope that hunts for great companies based on efficiency metrics like ROE and PE, and the top-down telescope that demands finding the winning macroeconomic neighborhood first.
We mapped the breathing of the global economy through the business cycle, from the spring of expansion to the winter of trough. And we mastered the tactical art of sector rotation, rotating into basic materials to exploit pricing power during the inflationary peak, hiding in the inelastic demand of consumer staples during the contraction, and riding the deferred gratification of cyclical durables during the expansion.
We traced the biological clock of the industry life cycle. We saw the cash-burning, brutal survival war of the introduction phase, the skyrocketing sales but compressing margins of the growth phase as new entrants swarm, the long, saturated, efficiency-obsessed consolidation of maturity, and the inevitable, technologically driven death spiral of the decline phase.
We classified industries by how they react to the macro weather. Growth industries that create their own gravity, cyclical industries that swing violently with the economy, defensive industries built for steady dividend income during storms, and the paradoxical cyclical growth tech hybrids.
And finally, we armed you with the ultimate X-ray vision of Porter's 5 forces. You no longer just see companies, you see the structural pressures of rivalry, the magnetic threat of new entrants, the hostage negotiations of buyer and supplier power, and the silent assassination of substitutes. You can now look inside an industry and determine if it is structurally designed to generate wealth, or if it is a trap of high competition and zero margins.
I hope you realize what we just did. By mastering these interlocked frameworks, you are not just memorizing bullet points for a test. You are fundamentally rewiring the way you perceive the business world. When you read the Wall Street Journal tomorrow, you won't just see a company launching a product. You will see a firm desperately trying to build a barrier to entry. You won't just see a boring jobs report. You will see a leading indicator signaling a massive shift in sector rotation. You are now thinking, analyzing, and strategizing like a true security analyst.
And before we let you go, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to ponder. It builds on the concept of the tech factor we discussed regarding the life cycle. We noted that technological obsolescence shortens the duration of an industry's life. Think about the world today. Think about the accelerating, almost incomprehensible pace of AI, automation, and synthetic biology.
Technology is evolving exponentially faster than it did even 10 years ago. It's compressing time.
Exactly. So here is the question for the future of finance. If technological innovation continues to accelerate at this breakneck, exponential pace, constantly compressing the industry life cycle, will the long, stable maturity phase eventually disappear entirely? Will future industries no longer have 50 years of stability? Will they just bounce violently between rapid explosive growth and sudden terminal decline?
If an industry is disrupted the moment it finishes growing, it never gets to mature.
And if that happens, think about how that completely breaks traditional investing theory. Think about the defensive investing strategy we discussed, buying mature companies for steady dividend income. Where do you hide your money for safety if the pace of technology guarantees that no industry is ever stable enough to reach maturity again?
That is a terrifying, fascinating, multi-billion-dollar question to take into your exam and into your future career.
Master the frameworks, understand the mechanics, and you are going to crush this material. Until next time, keep analyzing the neighborhood.